Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Burson. I'm the Chair of Asia Talent Mobility Alliance, or ATMA as we are known. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this immigration webinar called Immigration Compliance and Corporate Governance, which is primarily going to be led today by Debbie Baynon. And I'll have Debbie introduce herself in a second. This is actually the second part of a two-part series on immigration. I think many of you will be aware who ATMA is. There's a little bit of information on the screen about us there. We are basically around to enhance the innovation and development of talent mobility in Asia. So we'd love to have you all as members. So please, do join us and become an ATMA member, and we'd love to have you on board. This is just a quick screenshot of all of our board members at ATMA. So we have a variety of board members from a number of different sectors across the industry to try to bring you a variety of content, including in-person events and webinars like this. We have four pillars at ATMA. You can see them there on your screen. I'm not going to read them out to you, but if you're interested in any of these pillars, please do get in touch. We have a committee for each of the pillars, and we'd love to have your engagement in those committees. So thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm now going to turn over to Debbie to get us underway. Thank you so much, Debbie, for making time again today to bring us this presentation on immigration compliance.
And
so
Steve,
I'll
thank
let you introduce yourself and take it forward. Thank you.
Hello, Steve, and thank you. My name is Debbie Baynon, and I'm the Director of Immigration Services for the Asia Pacific region for Crown World Mobility. And what I'd like to do today, this is the second of two webinars. If some of you may have attended the first one, if you didn't, we will be able to provide you with a link to the recording and the slides from the first webinar. And this is the second webinar. And really, this is to follow on from the first one. And we're talking about corporate governance, sponsor obligations, data protection, audit readiness, and essentially the future of immigration and where it's going, very much with a compliance background in mind. So as Steve has mentioned, I'm the Director of Immigration Services, and Steve obviously is the Director for ATMA. So corporate governance, essentially sponsor obligations are now the cornerstone of immigration compliance globally. Governments are increasingly assessing immigration risk through more behavioural controls and the governance over sponsoring employers, not solely through individuals now, and not solely through individual visa applications. Compliance isn't an administrative HR function anymore. It's a material corporate governance function, and also a corporate risk issue. So the question really is, why do sponsor obligations matter now more than they've ever done? There's been a shift from policy guidance to active enforcement. So immigration authorities worldwide have moved now from issuing guidance to actually enforcing sponsor obligations. And those enforcements are being actioned through audits, through inspections, and increasingly through data-led monitoring. Employers are expected to demonstrate ongoing compliance throughout a full life cycle of a sponsorship. Now, the life cycle could be the life cycle of an assignment for one individual, Or in some locations, you have active sponsor registrations. Australia is a good example of that, where you register as a sponsor for 5 years. So throughout that 5-year period, you have an obligation in order to register to meet the regulatory requirements. Employers are now the primary enforcement target. It's shifted very decisively away from individuals to sponsoring entities. Sponsors are expected to monitor roles, salaries, work locations, and activities of their sponsored employees. And if they have role drift, if you have unreported changes, weak record keeping, there is now likely to trigger enforcement action. The obligations really do extend beyond that very first visa application. There's alignments between visa conditions, actual work, a very important timely reporting of any changes, and also very much maintenance of audit ready files. We'll come to that in a little bit. But compliance now is a continuous function. It isn't a transactional function anymore.
So Debbie, what are the penalties for non-compliance in terms of these sponsor obligations?
Okay, so when an employer sponsors a foreign national, they actually assume a legal and ongoing obligations that extend beyond the approval of the visa itself. So the penalties that can be enforced can include financial penalties. They can include continued auditing, which means they may not just come in once, they might come in as many times as they feel they need to ensure that the employer is actually completing and enforcing the regulations. And at the very top end, you can have a sponsor license or the ability to sponsor overseas employees revoked. And clearly, if you do have your license revoked, that is going to have a fundamental impact on your business and on your operational ability to be able to attract talent. So they can be the penalties can be very severe, and on top of that, and equally as important for any employer is reputational damage, because if you have a sponsor license revoked, as an example, for non-compliance, it is likely that may well get picked up in the media, and then it's going to be reported. And essentially, your reputation as an employer could be quite badly damaged, alongside all of the other penalties that you may well have attached to the problem. And just finally, from a sponsor obligations perspective, technology, and again, we're going to come to this a little bit later as well, technology has reduced the tolerance of grey areas around the regulatory requirements. So, digital visas are being issued now. There's biometric systems in place. There's a lot of country cross-data sharing within departments. So it's shifted from very much paper-based to what is now known as behavioural compliance. And the behavioural compliance is essentially how the sponsor is reacting to meeting those obligations. So essentially, what were potentially grey areas are now being directly challenged. So essentially, a key takeaway from the sponsor obligations perspective is sponsorship obligations and employer obligations are no longer a back office requirement. They are a critical component of corporate governance. Risk management and really ethical employment And anything that a sponsoring employer does can directly impact workforce strategy and potentially business community if you've had a license revoked. The next thing...
It's pretty clear then. We have to be very careful.
Absolutely.
Just as we move to this new slides, what's the how is data privacy linked to immigration compliance?
Okay, and I mean,
I know that
essentially the two link together because data privacy, as we all now know, is something that is very, very, very important. It's very important to employers. It's very important to individuals, and there are some detailed, laws and regulatory requirements around data privacy now. Immigration compliance and data privacy are now virtually inseparable. Because obviously everything that is managed from an immigration perspective generally has personal identifiable information, PII information, attached to it. With compliance becoming digital, everything is being connected. And so the issue here now is that employers need to meet dual regulatory requirements. They have to meet the immigration law requirements, so they have to collect and monitor and retain detailed information, but they also have to be very mindful and adhere to data protection laws, and so their two are very, very closely linked.
Right.
So in a sense, as we've mentioned, that is a critical point. Immigration and the compliance and data privacy are inseparable. As you can see here, the immigration law essentially asks an employer and asks an individual who's seeking a visa to provide information for a visa application. Now, from the perspective of a vendor managing that application, the only people that really should see that data are the people managing that case itself. If you have a third-party vendor, then obviously they will be contracted to you as a vendor, and then they will obviously have to adhere to the same standards. But immigration law essentially asks for a lot of documentation that does contain PII data. It also asks for quite a lot of information from employers that actually expands beyond the individual who's applying for a visa. So in some countries, if you take Thailand as an example, an employer has to provide tax and social security documentation to immigration to prove to the immigration authorities that they are operating legally and that they are paying the required tax and social security for the employees that they have. But the documentation doesn't just focus on the individual who's applying for a visa or having a visa renewed. That is a total document for every single employee within that company. So there is a huge data protection issue, and it's only going to immigration because immigration need to see it. But you have to be very, very careful about who then sees that within the business itself. So when you're looking to collect documentation and asking for documentation, you have to be very, very careful about who you're sharing that documentation with. And then equally, coming back to the data protection laws, most employers will adhere to the GDPR. The GDPR is the EU regulation, and that is the highest level of data privacy. Individual countries have their own data privacy laws as well. So it's not just one regulation that needs to be adhered to, it's two, it maybe is two or more. And even for GDPR, which generally applies to EU nationals, because it is the highest standard, it is generally the standard that is utilized from an immigration perspective worldwide. We in Crown certainly use that globally in relation to the level of protection that is used for a data privacy perspective. And because of the digitalization of everything, and the reason that things are connected, you've got to be very, very careful that things are handled securely. You've got to be very, very careful that there is adherence to cross-border data transfer requirements. You've got to have very, very clear document retention and deletion redaction policies, and they all have to be available. Adherence to any reporting requirements that your client, that you as the or the employer has as your client. Data redaction. Contracts with clients should have data redaction highlights and policies within them. As an example, banking clients are now very, 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 very careful around data protection, and banking clients can specifically ask for data to be redacted within days of that person leaving the business. And you, as maybe the immigration vendor, have to provide that reporting to that client to ensure that you can prove that you've redacted that data. And then if that client comes in to maybe conduct an audit, you are going to have to provide that evidence retrospectively to continue to show that that redaction has been done and is continuing to be done. And so not only really is it the requirement of the employers, but us as immigration vendors, obviously you have to have strong contracts, you have to have strong governance frameworks to ensure that everyone is really adhering to the data privacy requirements. So it is very, very clear, and there's a very important trend now that, especially from the banking side, that with regulation and data sharing, that there are there's some very high expectations, and that when contracts are being signed now, data privacy and data PII management is becoming very, very important in relation to the management of immigration and immigration compliance. Oh, sorry. The next thing I'd like to kind of highlight is linked to the discussion we've had up until now, is in relation to employers being ready for audit. This is very much, again, back to the compliance frameworks that they have in place in order to ensure that employers are meeting the obligations that they have. So audit readiness is an ongoing compliance obligation. So regulators will look for sustained controls and evidence of process. They're not just looking to address a visa outcome. Enforcement on this side is increasing. So basically, you have to ensure that audits can be unannounced and can occur at any time and potentially long after a visa has been approved. Sometimes audits will be planned. Sometimes they can be triggered by data analytics that are taking place, or even by cross-agency data sharing. So I think everyone has to be very, very clear around the fact that audits are out there and are now being increasingly used from an enforcement perspective.
Just a bit of a question there, sort of related to the data privacy we were talking about. So if documents are redacted, or they have to be, they're under some retention policy or whatever, which means they have to be destroyed or whatever to keep the compliance of that side of things, how does that kind of work when you get audited for something and those documents no longer exist. Just wondered right now what happens in those sort of circumstances.
In those circumstances, you would have evidence of the contract that you hold with that particular employer. So the contract itself will have highlighted that there was a redaction policy in place. And then you will be able to provide evidence that you were reporting to the client that the redaction had taken place. So I think it's really about the documentation that is available. So if you have a contract that indicates with a client that you have to redact that data within 5 days of that person departing the employment of that company, and that contract also stipulates that you have to report to that client that redaction has been done within 5 days, that is the evidence that you were holding the data, but that it's been redacted and you no longer hold it because that's part of your contractual requirements to that client.
Right. So you need to keep all of those communications, obviously.
Exactly.
Right.
Everything needs to be highlighted and everything needs to be retained. Correct. Yes. So that's the critical point. And I think the critical point here also is now that the expectation of the document retention, the expectation of the records that are being kept, it needs to be continuous and it needs to be consistent. It's not transactional anymore. It has to be something that is continually monitored, continually overseen. And as you can see from the slide here, reviews, testing, gaps that are highlighted, you need to be able to pick them up and they need to be remedied. So key internal controls should include things like visa expiry tracking, potential alignment between travel and work locations. In some locations or in some countries, the actual work location has to be detailed on the work permit. And if that person is then traveling to another part of the country, then they will not legally be able to technically go into the office or even, really hold meetings because there's no indicator on that work permit that they have the ability to effectively be employed in that specific location. So it is really important that traveling and work locations and the authorization of any work location is monitored carefully. Obviously, validity checks on documents. So
I was just looking at the mock number 5, the mock audit, having been involved in a number of audits, far too many audits in my life. I can't imagine the motivation you need to do a mock audit. Do you actually do that at your own organization?
Yes, you have to, because the reality is you just do not know when anybody is going to come. So for us, as an example, we have audits from clients. So the clients that we work for will come into our office and expect us to be able to provide all of the information that they actually want to see. One of our clients, as an example, actually goes to one of our data centers. So they go to a data center to check that the work and the level of protection that is within that data center meets their requirements. We also have a client who actually has CCTV or a required CCTV installed within our office. So they can check who has access to that office if they want to.
Wow.
So it can go to quite significant levels. And, that is the level that basically this goes to now.
Okay.
So it can be quite complex. And that is why although, as you quite rightly say, Steve, mock audits do take time. They do take up a lot of time. They do involve quite a lot of people, perhaps. In reality, for an employer, essentially that's critical, because it's not going to be it's going to be the government that are going in to an employer to check everything. And if that employer isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing, then we've just spoken about the penalties that can take place. And also for us as vendors, equally, if we cannot show our clients that we are taking this seriously, then we could lose that contract. And that could have a huge financial penalty for you as a vendor, as an example.
Obviously.
It's both sides, yeah. And so the critical point, I think, from an audit readiness perspective, from both a client, an employer, and even a vendor, has to be that you've got to demonstrate process and consistent processes, and not just outcomes. So you've got to be on top of this the whole time. And the other side to this, which is very, very critical now particularly, is ignorance of the regulations, or demonstrated or perceived ignorance of the regulations, is not an acceptable excuse anymore for lack of compliance or for non-compliance. The auditors, the regulatory requirements, the authorities will not accept any excuse that you did not know, or you say you did not know what the requirements were. That is not going to get you very, very far anymore. Ignorance of the regulations are not going to be an acceptable excuse now for non-compliance. So what I'd kind of like to do now perhaps is move on a little bit and move on to technology and compliance. You know, we're all now working with technology. We're all now working with different levels of technology. And in a sense, technology is no longer an optional feature of the work that is taking place within the immigration space now. It's certainly no longer optional in relation to immigration compliance. It's actually core to any risk management, it's core to any governance, and it's core to being audit ready, as we've just discussed. So the compliance world has changed big style, as we've just been talking about. Manual tracking, using spreadsheets, using fragmented processes is no longer really acceptable in this digital data-driven age that we're now working with. Governments are now technology-enforced enablers. They are using digital and biometric systems that absolutely reduce discretion and also increase detection of non-compliance. So essentially, if you're entering and exiting a country and you are potentially going in as a visitor and you're going in and out through the biometric gates, and potentially maybe you're going in once a week, you're going in once every 2 weeks, or you're going in 1 week a month, the authorities will know that and they will start to track that. And going forward, if you think that that's being done on a regular basis over a period of a couple of months, maybe, it's going to start to ask questions. You know, in the past, it's always been left to an immigration officer to look at someone as they enter the country, to look at the passport, look at the stamps in the passport, and then maybe ask a question about what you're planning to do when you're in the country. Now, a lot of the time, you do not see an immigration officer when you're going in and out of certain locations. In fact, the majority of locations now. But what all of that digitization is actually doing is actually allowing the immigration officers more time to do some of this back-end detection. They're using the digital footprints, they're using the entry and exit data, and that is then flagging potentially people that are going in and out as visitors when potentially they might be doing things outside of a visitor requirement. If people are going in for, say, 2-3 months at a time, because some nationalities are able to enter countries for up to 90 days. Some nationalities are able to enter countries for up to 180 days. So if you go into a country and spend 80, 90 days there and then leave, and within weeks go back and spend another 80 or 90 days there, that is going to raise a red flag. You won't have seen an immigration officer, but that biometric and the data behind that entry and exit are going to be there, and they are going to raise red flags. So I think it's really important that that is understood now, and technology is really starting to drive compliance, and it's really starting to drive decision making that the authorities are doing. Thailand is another example of this. Thailand has specifically, very recently, clamped down on what they call visa runs. And this is exactly the same thing. People are spending 30 to 60 days in Thailand. They're leaving, they're going out of the country for less than 24 hours, and then they're coming back, and then they're looking to spend another 60 days there. And this is going on ad infinitum. Now, that is being stopped. They've reduced the actual visitor requirement back to 30 days. And now they are tracking people coming and going. And if somebody's been there for any length of time, has gone out and is now trying to get back, they're actually being stopped and they're not being allowed entry. Because the question is, what are you actually doing in Thailand for long periods of time when you don't have the right visa? So there's a lot of that happening. Singapore is using what's called a data tracking system, and they're doing two things. They're trying to work out a way of effectively reducing illegal entry before it actually happens. And the way they're doing that, again, is assessing the biometrics, assessing the data that they have. But what they're now doing is, through that tracking system, they are notifying airlines that there are specific names, specific people that they do not want to have boarded onto these planes and enter Singapore. So it's shifting the enforcement away from post-entry to before entry as well. And the airlines are cooperating with the authorities in Singapore. And there's been something like a 30 to 40% change in the number of refusals because people are now not able to get on the plane in the first place. So it's quite important that everyone kind of realizes how the automation that is now continuing to develop is really affecting overall immigration compliance.
Good thing for HR, human resources to understand that there is a lot more risk to the way you do your business travel and how it may look from the outside, right? So
I think that is very, very important, and it's also about the activities as well. Even if you're going to a location as a business visitor, it's also, and you may only want to stay a week, but it's also very much around what are you actually going to be doing while you're there. A lot of HR managers or a lot of people that don't have immigration experience don't recognize that actually there are business visa requirements, and you can't just go in as a visitor and do whatever you want to do. You know, and especially now the visa regimes in a lot of locations have eased slightly, where, you know, you've got quite a lot of countries now that are, from a reciprocity perspective, potentially, as an example, use China. China now has essentially virtually carte blanche to travel around the Asia Pacific region as visitors, almost visa free. Not every single location, but a lot of the locations now, a lot of the big, you know, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Chinese can enter those locations visa free. But it's being seen as a way around the wider perspective of applying for the right type of visa in order to go to do what you want to do. But it is being picked up, and that kind of thing is not going to be able to continue for too long. I think the critical point here is that, you know, technology is really becoming a big part of managing the visas themselves, tracking the visas, and also from a reporting perspective, but very much around the compliance monitoring as well. But as we've said, automation and technology is no longer an option. Everybody needs to ensure that we have the right technology in order to be able to monitor what is happening, be ready for when the audits come through, and also essentially make sure that everything is compliant where it needs to be. Looking to the future, you know, what is happening? You know, things have been moving on. The governments are, the world of mobility is changing. And I think the world of mobility will continue to change. You know, there's a few more digital nomad locations now. We've talked about the biometrics, and we've talked about the expansion of biometrics. AI is becoming a big part of the immigration landscape, but I think it's very, very important to understand that AI can be very powerful, and AI can be something that can be very, very helpful, but it has to be verified. Not all of the information that comes from ChatGPT or Copilot or wherever you get your AI-powered information from is accurate. It is helping with processing, and it is helping to make the workloads of both ourselves as immigration practitioners and of the governments, as we've discussed, more efficient. But you have to be aware that there are limits to it, and you do still need the human touch. So, you know, from the policy horizon, there's still a lot happening in relation to governments protecting their local workforces. So a lot of locations have annual salary reviews. As an example, Australia is going to be increasing its minimum salary from 76,000 Australian dollars, or just over 76,000 Australian dollars, to 79,000 Australian dollars on the 1st of July 2026. So that is quite a big chunk of additional revenue, additional salary that has to be paid in order to ensure that the local workforce is protected. You know, the compass regulations in Singapore continue to increase the salaries, continue to monitor and change in order to be protectionist to the local workforce as well. But equally, governments are still looking to attract talent. So coming back to Australia, there's been a lot of reform in Australia since November 2024. The visa threshold, the short-term visas and the long-term visas were all amalgamated into essentially one TSS visa, anything from 1 to 4 years. And then they allowed all visa holders with only 2 years experience to be able to make an application for permanent residency. So, the permanent residency processing in Australia is stretched from 3 months to now 20 months because so many people have taken it up. But, I think that's really important. So alongside the enforcement that's happening, there's a lot also going on. So, from the question of what's the future for immigration, or more importantly, what's the future for immigration compliance? I think a few takeaways from that will be that it's not transactional. It needs to be continuous. That compliance, that regulatory compliance has to be continuous.
Just circling back to audits and that sort of thing. When a regulator sort of, when they come in for an audit, what are they expecting to see in order to, I don't know, clear somebody of any wrongdoing or perhaps the opposite, to find somebody of doing some wrongdoing? What are they looking for when regulators come in for an audit?
They're actually expecting to see documentation that relates to each of the individuals that are employed in that business, especially the ones that are there, foreign nationals who are on visas. So they will come back and they will look at, again, things that we kind of touched on in the first webinar. They will come and look for that person's right to work, confirmation that those checks were done during the recruitment process, perhaps. They will check the education requirements. They will check that the person actually has the education or the skills in order to do the role that they're doing. They will come in and check that there is a contract in place to make sure that the work terms and conditions of the work are there. That more importantly, that the salary that's being detailed in the contract is actually being paid. Very importantly, from the visa perspective, there will have been a job description. There will have been a very detailed role description provided to the immigration authorities in order to obtain that visa. Is that person still doing that job? They could go essentially and not just meet with the HR managers or meet with the global mobility managers. They could ask to go and see that individual at their desk. They could actually go and chat to see exactly what this person is doing.
Which is kind of interesting, isn't it, when people are working from their desk at home? Does that mean we're going to have immigration professionals ringing our doorbells at any time in the future to make sure that we are actually doing the work that we were, telling everybody that we were doing?
That is not beyond the bounds of possibility. And in some locations, I do know that has happened, yes.
Wow. Okay.
I think that it's probably not as obvious and not happening a huge amount at the moment.
Right.
But it can happen, yes. So, I mean, the same as people on other types of visas, as an example. So if you're in a country and you're on a retirement visa, as an example, coming back to exactly that scenario, if you're on a retirement visa, you're not supposed to be working at all.
Right.
Obviously, the immigration officer knows that you have a retirement visa. They know where you are. They know where you live. There is absolutely nothing to stop them coming and knocking on your door and finding out whether or not you're sat in an office working.
Right.
So yes, and I do know that that has happened as well.
Right.
So it's
Okay.
not even just for employers, it's for other visa types as well. It's across the whole board.
Right.
So, and of course, coming back to the fact that the authorities themselves do have more time now because they're not manning desks at airports
Right.
anymore.
Right.
So,
Okay.
they're all being redeployed.
Look out.
They're all being redeployed to do other things. Exactly.
Yeah.
So coming back to, compliance is not going to be paper-based that much more now. It is from an audit perspective, but it's also about behavioral compliance as well. Technology, obviously, technology-enabled enforcement we've talked about, and that's going to become the norm. So essentially, the other thing that we are predicting is that employer sponsorship and the regulatory requirements around becoming an employer sponsoring visas is going to become more and more regulated in a lot of countries. You have the UK where you have to register with the UK Border Agency as an example. You have Australia where you obviously have to be registered with the Department of Home Affairs. In New Zealand, you have to be registered as an accredited sponsor. We believe that that is going to become a little more, it's going to get expanded out to other countries and to other locations as well. And there's going to be more regulatory requirements around essentially being given the ability to have access to the foreign talent coming in, to actually monitoring that talent and bringing it in and being responsible for it. Another thing that is also kind of coming up from the sponsorship perspective is employers of record. A lot of countries are now essentially saying we will not allow EORs to sponsor work visas. And the reason for that is because the EOR is holding the visa, yes. The EOR may well be paying essentially that employee in that location, but that employee is actually really employed by someone else, another employer, and they're doing a job for another employer. The EOR is there because the employer doesn't have an entity in that location. And Singapore, as an example, now will not allow EORs. There's a lot of other locations now that are China, Japan, they're not allowing EORs to operate because of the complexities around the obligations in relation to the sponsorship side and then what the employee is actually doing. And I think the other thing that we will see coming back to the digital nomad frameworks is that remote work, it's not going to go away. It's something, as you've mentioned, Steve, that is now embedded in the way that people work, the way that some people expect to be able to work. So I think remote work, regional mobility, and mobility in general is going to continue to be redefined around the types of visas that are available, around compliance, and making sure that things are all operating in the way that they should. So that really kind of concludes everything I wanted to highlight to everybody. I hope it's been interesting. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, and I've just actually checked the question and answers. I don't have any questions from anybody at this time, but if anybody has anything that they'd like to ask Debbie about today's presentation, we are here to take your questions. Otherwise, I will just make a short notice. You could just go, click through to the end of the presentation. Yeah. We do have an upcoming ATMA conference on the 19th of November. That'll be in person in Singapore, although there will also be a virtual component to this conference. So probably about 50% of the conference will be live streamed for others in Asia who want to take part. So please do put that in your calendar, the 19th of November, later on this year. We'd love to see you in person here in Singapore. So no further questions at this time, it seems, Debbie. So I think we can probably call things to an end.
Okay. Well, thank you ever so much for attending, everybody. Like we've said, the recording and the slides will be available. We'll send them out to everyone who's registered to attend. But thank you very much. And obviously, you're very welcome to contact either Steve or myself if you have any questions going forward. And if you make it to the conference, we'll look forward to meeting you.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you so much for your time and for all the wonderful content in today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.